everyone. So nice to see so many of you here on a Monday night. This is definitely the first time I've ever given a lecture on X-Men. And you'll see why I picked this topic in this movie to complement my book, because really thinking about the way the X-Men universe actually, treats people with genetic difference has a lot of parallels to how our own society functions. So I wanted to begin just by showing a couple of quotes from the movie and how it relates to how science actually talks about human difference. This particular quote has to do with mutation. So it says, mutation is the key to our evolution. It is how we have evolved from a single cell organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years, but every few millennia, evolution leaps forward. So in our own societies and populations, we do have a lot of human variation, and some of that variation leads to different kinds of traits. Some of these traits might be considered disabilities depending on your framing. And these traits can be either visible or invisible, they can be acquired or inherited, or they can be physical or intellectual or neurological. So some of these are apparent upon meeting somebody, and some of them are more of an internal identity that is not so easily seen. When we look at changes in genes, you see that they can play out in different ways in different people. So this is known in the genetics world as variable expressivity. And in the X-Men universe, they have the X gene, where there's a particular variant that leads to all of these different kinds of traits or abilities. In the X-Men universe, that could be things like telepathy, telekinesis, sonic control, ability to fly, all kinds of unusual traits. And in the world of X-Men, this has to do with a single change in a single gene. That's a little bit far-fetched in real life. When we do have a single change in a single gene, there is a variety of different potential expressions, but not usually in the whole range of ability to fly to telekinesis. That's a little bit of a stretch, maybe scientifically. I do want to say, though, when you think about human difference, when we look at different populations, there's a common misconception, as shown on the Venn diagram on the left, that if you look at different populations, you'll actually see that people are very different at the genetic level, too. But in reality, the truth of the matter is that we are much more alike than we are different. So if you look at the Venn diagram on the right, that shows the level of different genetic variation within populations. And you see the vast majority of variation is actually seen within the single population. If you try to look across populations, there's only a tiny sliver of additional variation. So that really tells us that we are much more alike than we are different. I think that's an important message in the context of this movie as well. So here's another quote. This is from Hank McCoy to Raven, and he says, "You got to see this. Your genes are extraordinary. You know that? Your cells age at half the rate of the normal human. When you're 40, you'll still have the leukocytes of a teenager. You have the most incredible cell structure I've ever seen." Just showing you that it's really a matter of perspective about genetic variation. Is disability a strength or a weakness? It's all a matter of perspective. When you think about perspective and thinking about disability, there's two different models of looking at disability. The medical model is when you look at something in terms of genetic variation and think that there's a deficit to be fixed. The social model is when somebody has a genetic difference and the issue with them not being able to access something has to do with the environment. So in the social model here, you can see that this person's inability to access the staircase means that the building itself is inaccessible. Whereas in the medical model, they would say that the problem lies within the body. So this is an important distinction because when you think about the framing, it tells you where you think the deficit lies, right? In the social model, the deficit really lies with how the building is constructed. And when you think about the way the model is framed, it also influences how you approach how you want to deal with the differences and somebody's ability or inability to access something. And so here in this quote, you can see Hank is still talking to Raven, who's also known as Mystique, and he says, "It behooves me to tell you that even if we save the world tomorrow and mutants are accepted into society, my feet in your natural blue form will never be deemed beautiful. We need this cure." And she replies, "You're beautiful, Hank. Everything you are, you're perfect. We are different, but we should not be trying to fit into society. Society should aspire to be more like us, mutant and proud." So she's taking the framing that they don't need to be cured. And that's really the social framing of disability as opposed to the medical framing of disability. So if you were to look at these two different frameworks, again, thinking about examples from the world of disability, you can see that, depending on the accessibility of a particular theater, somebody may have difficulty watching a film at a movie house because maybe it's not deemed accessible or it doesn't have closed captioning available for deaf patrons, for instance. Whereas the medical model would say, there's an issue with your hearing, we need to intervene and fix your hearing. So that's just an example of how the medical model versus the social model plays out. And in the X-Men universe, they talk about if they should actually go about pursuing curing of the differences at the X-Men level. In deaf culture, there's actually a really great example to follow up on that example some more. With deafness, there's a whole culture around people who are hard of hearing. And this culture really is a shared experience. It's often a result of a shared culture that grows out of deaf schools. So those cultures are shared within families and within the general community of deaf individuals. And what you can see is somebody can actually be born deaf or they can acquire deafness in the course of their lifetime. Deaf culture is really mostly people who are born deaf. But when you follow the genetics of deafness, what you'll learn is actually that many, many deaf children are born to hearing parents. The majority, actually, of deaf children are born to hearing parents. And the majority of deaf parents can have hearing children as well. So this is a difference that you might not expect, that there would be a culture clash within a family. The thing about deaf culture that's really important to highlight in this context is that deaf culture has a shared pride within the culture, and it's not pathologized. It's not necessarily thought of something that needs correction. So there may be there are often times people in the deaf culture who will choose not to go for cochlear implants, or who will specifically choose to have children who are deaf themselves rather than choose a hearing child. So these are different frames of reference for us that we should all consider and think about whether society is telling us what is a deficit versus what is a strength. So on that point, so who decides what is normal versus what is desirable? Here's another quote, which I've highlighted the blue section here, and this is a scene from World War II in the movie. And in the scene, the Nazi Party member, Klaus Schmidt, says, genes are the key, yes, but they're goals. Blue eyes, blonde hair, pathetic. So he's saying, as you may know, the history of the Nazi Party includes this eugenic framing, where they want to try to prioritize a particular outcome among their community and their culture. And what you can see here is that when they decide what's normal, then they ascribe a value to specific physical traits, and that's imposed externally. And they imposed it in very harmful and horrible ways. And this is really just an incredibly subjective type of framework. It is harmful to the people who are outside of what they deem or define as normal. And it also, the central principle, like with all forms of bias, is maintaining hierarchy. This is not so long in the past, and in fact, thinking about eugenic principles in general, this is a scenario that we see repeated and echoing in many times. Eugenic principles are essentially when somebody's decided a particular trait or series of traits are the most desirable traits, and they want to accentuate or improve representation of those traits in the population at the expense of other traits. You can see here that this type of thinking continues in modern day. You may have seen headlines of different politicians talking about people with bad genes who need to be exiled from our country. And this has no scientific basis whatsoever. This is just pure unadulterated hate. And when it comes to being part of society, there's another element that we need to consider, and that element is belonging. So here's a quote from Raven, pictured here in blue. And Raven says, Charles, I used to think it's going to be you and me against the world, but no matter how bad the world gets, you don't want to be against it, do you? You want to be a part of it. And this is Magneto, where he says, this society won't accept us. We have to make our own. So belonging is such an important part of being part of a society. And when people are applying eugenic principles, it's definitely at the expense of belonging. They're trying to exile people. And belonging is just such an important component to our own well-being and our ability to thrive. What you'll see here on the genetic side of things is people who do have genetic conditions, they tend to be rare conditions, but if you look at them collectively as a cohort across all the different genes in the genome and the different types of conditions that can arise based on genetic difference, there are just thousands, millions of people who have these kinds of genetic differences. And so in honor of bringing them to a larger community, there is this function known as Rare Disease Day. It's always held on the last day of February, so Rare Disease Day, sometimes it falls on a leap day, that's why they picked that date. You might be perhaps not surprised to learn that due to all the turmoil that's happening in DC, it is unfortunately canceled this year. So the NIH normally invites patients with rare disease and advocates and politicians and funders, all sorts of people together to talk about what rare disease actually means. Because even if the genetic basis for your condition might differ from somebody else with a rare disease, you share that experience of having the complications of navigating the healthcare system where nobody's ever seen your condition before and having difficulty finding treatments that are appropriate for your condition. So there is a shared experience across all of these different rare disease individuals. So Rare Disease Day has been a really important event for them to be able to have some more of a sense of belonging. So the cancellation of this event really, I think, just underscores the current administration's views on people with disabilities. I also just want to leave you all with perhaps a more hopeful thought, which is that we have an ability to foster a sense of belonging, and that can happen with just a simple choice of words. So thinking about the ways in which you invite people into community by using words that are inclusive of all of their experiences. You can see here that in the past, in United States circus culture, there was the use of the word freaks, and that is definitely not an inclusive term, but you'll see that term come up in the context of the X-Men movies. And another thing that comes up with sense of belonging in the X-Men is this notion or this concept of a preferred or chosen name. And having that ability to, set forth your identity and be your authentic self is an important part of belonging as well, and that has to do with names as well as pronouns. So I think we can all do a lot with language use in terms of fostering a sense of belonging, and I hope that's given you a lot to think about as we go into the movie. And if you're interested in these topics and want to learn more, I would be delighted to share my book with you. We have some out in the lobby, and you can also take a snapshot and use the QR code to navigate to a purchase link. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the film.